Hi everyone, my name's Rachel and I'm a community librarian for local studies. Usually I work at Norfolk Heritage Centre. Today I'm going to talk about our Picture Norfolk online archive of images and look at how Norwich has changed over time. So Norfolk Heritage Centre, for anyone that hasn't visited, is located on the second floor of the Millennium Library in Norwich, and we collect usually anything printed and published to do with the history of Norfolk. Picture Norfolk is our online collection of over 20,000 local images, which reflect thousands of stories of Norfolk life spanning the last 150 years. Picture Norfolk shares images from the local studies collection, from Norfolk Museum Service and Norfolk Record Office and other private collections too. So today we'll look through the past 180 years of Norwich's changing landscape as seen through this Picture Norfolk collection. As custodian of the local studies collection at the Heritage Centre, I'm really particularly interested in how we came to acquire the items we have in the collection. So this talk will look at the development of our photographic collection, the range and scope of the material we hold, with particular focus on scenes of Norwich. And as well as looking at the changing streets and buildings, we'll also look at the changing styles and methods of photography. So this image shows you the city centre in the 1930s, and sort of at the centre left you can see the site which has been cleared ready for City Hall to be built. So a key date that we need to think about is 1913, and this is when the Norfolk Photographic Survey was formed and systematic collecting of photographic images began. Retrospective collecting of earlier images also happened at this time, and the Norfolk and Norwich Photographic Survey was started by the Public Library in 1913, and the aim of this was to create and maintain a contemporary photographic record of Norfolk life, documenting major local events throughout the year, but also to collect, and this is quoting the appeal that went out at the time, gone and forgotten images from previous decades of historical scenes that would add to this local treasure house of information. This man here is George Stephen, and he was the city librarian appointed in 1911, and he initiated this survey. And at the time of his appointment, Norwich libraries were apparently in a state of neglect and disorganisation. And he set to work improving the buildings, refining the stock, and he worked hard to collect books and material that represented the history of the city and the county. So this image is from 1912 from the flood, and this is Cowgate Street. And after the 1912 flood in Norwich, George Stephen received some photographic images of the damage and the destruction, and this inspired him to make an appeal to the general public for more images. And he asked for contributions to a collection of views of all subjects in any way connected with the county to be hoarded, numbered, indexed, mounted and cared for, and accessible to all. So this is what Norwich looked like in 1913. This is an image of a tram at Orford Place. And these are Suffragettes on Prince of Wales Road in 1913. So at the time that the Norfolk Photographic Survey was started, George Stephen was working from the Free Library on Duke Street, and on the left there, that's what it looked like in the early 20th century. On the right is what it looked like in the early 1960s. The Norwich Free Library was opened in the 1850s after the Public Libraries Act, and the local studies collection, which we now hold predominantly at Norfolk Heritage Centre, was started in 1879. The idea was to collect anything published on Norfolk and Norwich, not just books, but maps, photographs, postcards, transparencies, engravings, watercolours, pen and ink drawings, broadsides and printed ephemera. The most generous donor at this time was Walter Rye, and two librarians, George Stephen and Philip Hepworth, built on this collection, and by the mid-20th century Norwich's collection was rivalled only by the great metropolitan local history libraries at Manchester, Birmingham and Liverpool. This shows you the opening of the Norfolk Photographic Survey exhibition in the Public Library, and this is in 1913. The survey was closely supported by local photographic and scientific societies, and an exhibition of prints took place on the top floor of the City Library in 1913. The classes and themes at this exhibition included bygone Norfolk, architecture, art, geology and natural science, and this breadth of subject matter has been reflected in the collection ever since. Images collected by George Stephen included those going right back to the advent of photography. This image dates from the 1840s and it shows Norwich Marketplace and the Guildhall, and this was by Thomas Damon Eaton. The survey aimed to create a contemporary record of Norfolk life, documenting major events every year, but from the beginning, images from previous decades were also collected. Vanishing rural industries, traditional country festivities were of particular interest, as well as the products of the present generation, including mustard, boots, and medicated wine. So the Eaton collection is of international significance in the history of photography. This is a early self-portrait of the photographer Thomas Damon Eaton, and he was a Norwich silk merchant and the first president of the Norwich Photographic Society. He organised a photographic exhibition in Norwich in conjunction with the Norwich Fine Arts Association, which ran from November 1856 to February 1857. At the Heritage Centre, we now hold 3 albums of his collection, and these contain around 138 images dating from 1845 onwards. So this is an example of the original labels used to classify all Norfolk Photographic Survey photographs as they were added to the collection. This label is for a portrait of James Taylor of Norwich, taken by Thomas Damon Eaton. This salted paper print shows Norfolk Chronicle Printing Office and Chamberlain's, and this is the view from Eaton's office, which was on Gentleman's Walk. This is another of Eaton's images of Norwich Marketplace in the 1840s. So now we come to the 1850s, when stereoscopic cards were all the rage, and a stereoscope presented 2 images and optically fused them into one, giving the impression of 3 dimensions. The London Stereoscopic Company produced most of these, and the Picture Norfolk collection includes over 250 stereoscopic cards, including many scenes of Norwich. We don't know much about the photographers, but this image does feature the name of H. Thompson, stereoscopist. During the late 19th century, magic lanterns were another popular form of entertainment. They were the forerunner of modern slide projectors. Most magic lantern slides were created between 1890 and 1950. And in 1928, Harry Britton and Walter Rye donated over 700 lantern slides depicting interesting buildings which are now demolished to the local studies collection. The photographic collection eventually contained around 3,000 local lantern slides, and these were acquired so that people could borrow them to give talks and lectures, and they're a very popular collection. This lantern slide shows you the Norwich Subscription Library, which was used before the Free Library was built in the 1850s. It operated between 1784 and 1976, and it's on Guildhall Hill, and you may recognise it, it's now the Library Restaurant. It was the first public subscription library in Norfolk and one of the oldest in England. This shows you the fines, subscription costs and hours of attendance for the library. And this is what the interior looked like in the 1950s. This is another lantern slide, and it dates from the late 1800s, and it shows the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital in the background with a tram in the foreground. After the 1913 photographic survey collecting an exhibition, the First World War broke out in August 1914. So librarian George Stephen turned his attention to keeping a record of Norwich's contribution to the Great War effort. In 1917, a plea went out in the City and County of Norwich Public Library Reader's Guide, asking for local people to start donating any printed or written material that represented Norfolk's share in the Great War. In his request, Stephen asked for donations of printed records, photographs, portraits, press notices, letters, maps, posters and other printed material. to form the basis for the war section of the library's local collection. He planned to make the collection available for public inspection and to hold an exhibition of the donated material. The Imperial War Museum also requested that any duplicates of printed material relating to local war activities be forwarded to them. Local people were soon keen to donate items showing the role that Norfolk and its residents had played in the conflict. And in the Public Library Committee's annual report, which was published in March 1918, it was reported that considerable additions of photographs and printed material have been made to the section that was begun last year with the object of forming a local record of Norfolk's share in the Great War. Donations ranged from the political to the personal, so local businesses donated publications and pamphlets, organisations gave copies of posters for fundraising efforts, and grieving families sent memorial cards in remembrance of their loved ones too. This is an image that was donated at the time, and it shows you Norwich Marketplace, and these are volunteer soldiers on parade. This is a soldier from the Essex Regiment, and in the background you can see men from the Essex Regiment getting their haircuts, again in Norwich Marketplace. The survey featured over 1,000 portraits of local soldiers who served during the First World War. This is George Paschal Ii, who grew up in St Clement's Hill, Norwich, and he was born in 1894. And he went on to join the Royal Norfolk Regiment and fight in the First World War. He's pictured here on the left on his way to Gallipoli, and on the right he's recovering in an Australian hospital after being wounded at Gallipoli. He was injured there and he lost his memory, and while recovering in hospital he was assumed to be an Australian soldier, but was recognised by a visiting captain from the Norfolk Regiment, and he was sent back to England. After the war had ended, Stephen and the Public Library Committee joined forces with the Castle Museum Committee to curate the local war exhibition, and this was held at St Andrew's Hall and Blackfriars Hall in Norwich in May and June in 1920. This exhibition displayed many of the donations given to the library, including over 1,000 portraits of local soldiers who served and died during the First World War. As he had planned originally, Stephen presented the First World War material publicly for the benefit of the people of Norwich. Now we jump forward from one World War to the next. The photographic collection continued growing beyond the career of George Stephen and continued to represent the changes seen in the city throughout the 20th century. A significant collection was that of George Swain, who was born in 1901, who joined the Swain family photography business aged 16 at their studio in St Giles Street. He spent his lifetime recording events in the city, and he was a pioneer in aerial photography. He was particularly recognised for his documentary work on the war, and he became the local official war photographer. This image shows you the Cayley's factory bomb damage during the Second World War. This is another of Swain's images, and it shows you war damage at St Benedict's Gates. 1,800 images from Swain's collection are available to view on Picture Norfolk. The overall collection of several thousand images is held at Norfolk Heritage Centre, and Norfolk Museum Service also have copies of the aerial and aviation related photographs. This is another Swain image showing you St Stephen's Street. And this is one of his aerial views of Norwich Marketplace in 1957. We move forward to 1961. The new Central Library on Bethel Street is about to be under construction. These buildings here were due to be demolished to make way for the new building. This image is from the Jeffery Gorham collection, which consists of 7 albums which show derelict, threatened and redeveloped areas of Norwich, taken from the 1960s to the 80s. Gorham was a teacher and a writer. He was born on Ketts Hill, and he had a regular local history newspaper column and published a history of Thorpe Hamlet. He was particularly interested in the Mousehold Heath area, and he recorded many of the buildings that were demolished during the 1960s when large redevelopment programmes were taking place there. That's what the Central Library looked like nearing its completion in 1962. At this time, the Heritage Centre's collections and its photographic collection were housed here after it officially opened in 1963. The view of Norwich from the Central Library. This is another of Jeffery Gorham's images, and it shows you the redevelopment of the Castle Meadow area of Norwich in the early 1960s. As we move now through the 1970s, this shows you Norwich Central Library as it looked in 1975. And now we move into the 1980s, and this was documented in a collection of photographs by Paul Harley, who photographed the changing political landscape with his images of demonstrations and groups of punks. This image shows a march in support of the miners' action. Norwich had a twinning arrangement with the pit town of Ollerton at this time, and food was taken up to the miners' welfare in Ollerton, and sometimes miners' children would come to Norwich for a holiday. It was one of a series of photographs taken by Paul Harley of Norwich events and street life in the early 1980s. This is another of Harley's images showing a CND demonstration taking place in Chapel Gardens on the 10th of October 1981. And as a photographer, Harley was drawn to groups of people who presented a colourful appearance and stood out from the crowd. He had a series of photographs focusing on performers at fairs, and this is one of his collection of images of punks. And this group were photographed in 1982 near the Clarendon Steps off Mill Hill Road in Norwich. So we move through the 80s to the 90s, and in 1994 disaster struck when on August the 1st Norwich Central Library was destroyed by a devastating fire. Many thousands of unique historic documents and over 100,000 books were damaged or lost by the flames and the water that was used to extinguish them. Fortunately, no lives were lost. The salvage operation that followed was a massive effort, and it involved teams of library, record office and other Norfolk County Council staff working alongside professional recovery agencies. Following the fire, the local community rallied round with offers of practical support and donations of local history material to replace that which had been lost. And this image here shows you the fire service working to extinguish the fire on that morning. This is where the centre of the fire was, in the area of the library, and the temperature at that point reached about 1,000 degrees Celsius. This is damage to the old staff desk and the music library. This shows you a member of library staff sorting through the piles of the burnt books and seeing what could be recovered. RAF cadets at RAF Coltershall assisted with the book drying operations. So a cadet here is airing out the rare book collections to making sure the water damage was minimised. So coming back to the photographic collection again. The fire destroyed around 15,000 prints of Norwich, some of which were very early images. Fortunately, many of the most important images had been copied before the fire, and those copies have since been purchased and returned to library holdings. In 1999, a very successful public appeal was launched to replace parts of the lost archive and to expand the collection. So this is a George Swain image of Orford Place taken in 1950, and it shows you the signs of the fire damage and the heat. Here we have the empty site from the Central Library preparing for the Forum to be built. And this is where our story ends, with the Forum, and this is it under construction in 2001. On the site of the old library building, a new state-of-the-art information centre, the Forum, and the original project name for this was Technopolis. The Forum was erected and it included the new Norfolk and Norwich Millennium Library. It opened for business on November 2001, and this site has seen such huge change during the 20th and 21st centuries, but remains the hub of the community today. So today the collection, which was originally based upon this 1913 photographic survey, contains a huge variety of material, from amateur and informal work to commercial pictures. And this includes newspaper reportage, portraiture, building and landscape surveys, tourism and advertising. There's work by the pioneers of photography in the region, collections by talented and dedicated amateurs, and interestingly also collections by early female practitioners. such as Olive Edis, Viola Grimes and Edith Flowerdew. More recent images of Norfolk life are now beginning to filter in, such as a village survey of Ashwellthorpe, which was taken by Richard Tilbrook throughout the 1970s. Paul Harley's images of alternative life in Norwich in the 1980s, and also redevelopment images that have been taken after the 1990s. We currently hold around 200,000 photographic items, and the majority of these are held at the Heritage Centre at the Millennium Library, but there are also collections held at King's Lynn Library, Great Yarmouth and Thetford Libraries. So to explore this photographic archive, visit www.picture.norfolk.gov.uk and you'll find over 25,000 images from the library and other collections. Each image is displayed with information and new items are regularly added. Thanks for listening to this presentation, and if you've got any questions, please email heritagecentre@norfolk.gov.uk and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.